Hi everyone, it's Denise from Dobby Books. Happy Saturday, and today is my weekly check-in, even though I forgot last week's check-in, so here we go. There are two books that I did finish this week that I want to show you, and the first one is Max in the House of Spies by Adam Gidwitz. There are two parts to this. This is the first one. And let me give you the scenario with this one. And I jotted some notes so that I wouldn't forget anything. So, with Max in the House of Spies, Adam Gidwitz being the author, Gidwitz also wrote The Inquisitor's Tale, which is a book that I have. It's beautifully done. It's also a Newbery Honor winner. And this book basically talks about the adventures of a 12-year-old Jewish boy from Berlin, and he is put on the Kinder transport to Holland, where he will then take a ferry to England, where a British family will adopt him. The reason that they sent the children and the parents didn't go is because all the countries, including the United States, said the children could come, but not the adults, because they already had too many Jews. Even the countries that didn't have any Jews. I just find that, as someone who didn't grow up during World War II, on one hand, I'm not totally surprised because the United States has its own history, right, of anti-Semitism. But it just sort of, it just didn't make any sense to me that they would break up the families. But, you know, same thing, different day, I guess you could say. And the thing with Max, he doesn't want to leave his parents. He's an only child. His father's just a simple watchmaker. And he was sent away after Kristallnacht, and his parents understood the danger that was happening. But once he's in England, and he is taken in by a well-to-do family in London, he continues to miss his parents. He continues to wonder, are they safe? Are they okay? He always felt like he was the one that had to step in and defend them, because his parents were such mild-mannered, gentle people. And he was the one that would stick up for them. And he always tried to stay, a few paces ahead of them to protect them from someone's anger or getting into some sort of misunderstanding with somebody else. A lot of responsibility, I think, for a 12-year-old. The family that does adopt him is a family in London. He starts going to a private school. He has to deal with the anti-Semitism at that school. But he learns early on that the family who's adopted him are also Jewish. And he learns how they have to sort of hide their Jewishness. It's like, he learns what it is to be English and Jewish, I guess you could say. And he compares it a lot with what it was like for him to be German and Jewish, and how each community throughout Europe of Jews had to deal with anti-Semitism in its own unique way, according to where they lived. And what had happened is there's a series of events that happens. He keeps trying to think of ways how he can go back to Berlin. And eventually he decides he's going to do something that will get the attention of the military superiors, that one of his uncles now in his new family, Ewan he works for, I forget, it's M15, I think I'm saying that correctly, M15 or M15 in Britain, who were spies during World War II. And the superior officer of Uncle Ewan is the one whom Max decides to capture the attention of. And this leads to him being interrogated and stating his case. I want to go back to Berlin. You can train me to be a spy, yada, yada, yada. And they're like, no, we don't have child spies. We're not sending you to Berlin. Long story short, he goes into training to be a spy. And at the beginning of the story, when he boards that train and then he's on the ferry, he meets two um, spirit creatures, immortal creatures, and one rests on each of his shoulders. And one's name is Berg. And Berg has what he refers to as an antique German accent. And Berg tells him that he's the spirit of Germany. And he's also called a kobold. And he compares that to a hobgoblin, what we would call a hobgoblin, a creature that causes all kinds of mischief. And the guy on his other shoulder, his name is Stein. Stein said he is the spirit of the Jewish people. And one of the terms that are used to describe him is a Dybbuk. You ever heard of a Dybbuk box? Scary things. But in the story, Stein says that he sticks to people and kind of makes their life miserable. And that's his job. And his accent is more like a vaudeville comedian, which I find hysterical. And these two just undercut each other the whole time. They're very funny with their exchange when they go back and forth. And when Max says, so this is a haunting, right? And on top of me being shipped away from my family, I get two guys that get to haunt me for the rest of my life. And they say, no, don't think of it as a haunting. Think of it more like annoying and heckling. So there's some humor in here that I really appreciated. And the story ends when Max eventually parachutes secretly just outside of Berlin. So now I'm reading book 2, which is entitled Max in the Land of Lies. And I will give you a little review on that. This is a young reader, so there's ages 8 through 12. And the great thing about this book, including it mentions the educator material at the back, I want to show you a picture. And in this picture, you're going to see on the top look like children on a train. And on the bottom is a man with his son. In that bottom picture, the man with his son, his name is Michael. I'll read it here. I became aware of the Kindertransport at a young age because a close family friend was one of those children. When he was 10 years old, Michael Steinberg was sent by his mother to live with the family in England. His story was very much like Max's. He was put on a train to Holland with other Jewish children and a few adult chaperones. They got on a ferry that took them to England. Then they waited anxiously at the dock to see which family would take them home. Many children never saw their parents again. Some were luckier. Michael was one of those relatively lucky ones. His mother was able to join him in England after the war. In the bottom picture, that is Michael at age 55, and that is his son, who happens to be the author. And then the picture above, one of those little boys on the train, is Michael Steinberg. And I got goosebumps when I saw this page to think what could have been lost if Michael had not gotten out of Germany. It really is a beautiful story, and I love how it blends a work of fiction into real life history, and it gives an appreciation for young people to really learn what it was like for at least a few people during World War II. So I finished this book. It has its little green dot, and it's going to go on my shelf. The next book that I finished reading is The Demon of Unrest by Erik Larson. Erik Larson also wrote The Devil in the White City and The Splendid and the Vile. This book is about the people and events that were leading up to the Civil War. This is a work of nonfiction. It's a narrative history, and I truly was just every page I wanted to know more and more and more. It was hard at times to put this book down, but I had to because I was getting very sleepy. It weaves together the letters, the journals, and the official reports that were produced during this time in history. So the author was using primary sources, and he put together this story. And even in exchanges, dialogue exchanges, he got those from the journals of those who wrote about that, who were there at the time. And that's another thing that really impressed me, were the journals. This is 19th century America. And as I would imagine it was in Europe, journal writing and letter writing were very common everyday occurrences. Letter writing, of course, was. Journal writing, maybe not as much, but maybe more than I realize. And some of the writings in these journals are so descriptive, like they're writing a story. Really, just beautifully done, how they use their words and how they organize everything. Something that I think I'd love to see more of. I really would, but the day and age that we live in, it's a little harder to achieve that, I think. Now, there are notables in here. There are quite a few names mentioned, but the ones that impressed me that I want to bring up with you is first President Buchanan. He was leaving office as the South and its secessionist proceedings began. Buchanan just wanted everything to be peaceful until he left office. He did not want to deal with this. Buchanan himself leaned toward favoring the South over the North, and he was just trying to keep everything peaceful and everybody happy. What the author does describe about Buchanan, which I never knew, he had a crooked eye. So in order to get that wandering eye to sort of blend in and people wouldn't notice, the author says he had a tendency to dip his head down and turn so that that wandering eye would be in the right place. And it would look like he was, focused and paying attention to you, or almost maybe doubting you, depending on who was the person being looked at. Very interesting. He also never married. And the way he described Buchanan's life gives me the impression, maybe the author was trying to suggest this, maybe he thought it would be better if he didn't. I could see how he was treading some water there that maybe he didn't want to go too deeply into. But I got the impression that it's possible that President Buchanan was gay. I haven't been able to look at any histories right now that might have mentioned Buchanan. I might do that at a different time and find out more information that I don't have now, but I'm going to read you an excerpt which gives me that impression. All right, and that is on page 100. Oh, there we are. And I think I'm gonna change my glasses because I can't see in these crazy things. But I got these new ones in a 3-pack, and they work great. Okay, here we go. Buchanan was tall, handsome, blonde, and apparently never had to shave. He did have one conspicuous imperfection, a misalignment of his eyes that caused his gaze to diverge in an alarming fashion. To compensate, he would tip his head forward and to the side with one eye focused on his listener, thereby imparting a look of skepticism or keen interest. And that's what he said about the eye. Going into the description of more personal, otherwise Buchanan seemed to be an ideal match for any woman, but therein lay the problem. He had no particular interest in being caught. Buchanan was a lifelong bachelor, a phenomenon American voters could not quite grasp. Newspapers called him Aunt Fancy. For years, when he was in Washington, he roomed with a fellow senator, William R. King of Alabama, himself an accomplished politician. The pair was so close, both in public and in private, that newspapers described them as a married couple, with Buchanan the husband, Senator King his wife. The death of King in 1853 left Buchanan bereft and alone. That right there made me wonder. Down here it says, because this was an issue with him being single, and I guess those in Washington tried to find a way around this, Buchanan had his own solution. He recruited his vivacious niece, Harriet Lane, to come live there as his companion and social hostess, a role she embraced wholeheartedly. So I'll leave that up to you to think about. Another one that I want to bring up is that throughout the book, starting on page, oh gosh, let's see. Oh, the title of the book comes from a letter that Dennis Hart Mahan, a New York-born, Virginia-raised professor at West Point, wrote in November of 1860 to a friend about how things were rumbling around in the US. Here it is. But when commerce, manufacturers, oh, here we go. There was a growing fear that maybe South Carolina's best days were behind her. And this is what Mr. Mahan wrote. But when commerce, manufacturers, the mechanic arts disturbed this condition of things, and he's referring to that lifestyle in the South, and amassed wealth that could pretend to more lavish luxury than planting, then came in, I fear, this demon of unrest, which has been the utmost soul disturber of the land for years past. So he felt that the South, and he was referring here, I believe, to South Carolina, were stuck in the past. The life they were living was something more along the lines of perhaps the Middle Ages, chivalry, duels, being very rich, owning a lot of land, having your social life and your hunting parties. And this was no longer applicable to the era. Now, the country was becoming more industrialized. The North was following in that progressive path, but the South insisted on keeping their old ways, and this is what they saw as the problem. The South was very much protective of this lifestyle of theirs, and they felt that they had the right to keep it. So you had two different worlds, two different countries residing on the same continent. And throughout the book, in each section, the author quotes from a book that's known as the Code of Honor, or Rules for the Government of Principals and Seconds in Dueling. Dueling was a common practice of the South during the 19th century. And it followed along the lines, of that chivalric, old world lifestyle that they had. That's why they were known for being very, very well-mannered and gentlemanly. It was all part of that culture. The short term for this book, or this guide, was known as the duello, as in duel. And he quotes it in each part of the book. He brings up a quote from that book, and of course, that's what's going to be covered in the next section of the book. I want to find a shorter quotation if I can. Here's one. When you believe yourself aggrieved, be silent on the subject. Speak to no one about the matter, and see your friend who is to act for you as soon as possible. The Code Duello. And you see how that plays out in that part of the book. I thought that was just fantastic. There's a quote here I want to pull. There are famous names that are mentioned. Edgar Allan Poe, who was an 18-year-old soldier who was stationed in 1827 and 1828. And he was there in South Carolina. Was it Fort Moultrie? And he was with one of the major figures there, I think John L. Gardner. Thought I'd throw that in. There's also the father of Harriet Beecher Stowe. And of course, they bring up Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which caused a huge reaction from both sides, both North and South. It was a bestseller when it came out, and the South was highly offended. They thought it was a lot of nonsense, exaggeration, which of course happened. Another major character that we're going to hear about, that you will read throughout this book, is a man known as Edmund Ruffin. He was from Virginia. This man had lots of energy. He was a fiery secessionist, and he'd been fighting for the South to secede from the rest of the United States for a long time, but he was always just sort of laughed at, not really taken seriously. He came from the planter aristocracy, and he was just simply unbending and determined. He comes up at the very beginning of the story, and he plays a role throughout, including when Fort Sumter, which is where the first shots were fired and where it's traditionally believed that this is when the Civil War started, was with Fort Sumter. He was one of those people there at Fort Sumter firing one of the cannons. And the end of the book ends with Edmund Ruffin as well. It's just a very interesting character. And next one is Mary Chestnut. Now, Mary Chestnut was the wife of one of the plantation owners. She lived on a huge estate. It was self-sufficient. It had mills, and it was almost like its own little village. And she was bored out of her mind there. This was a woman who was very well-read. She loved to socialize with other people, and she was quite impressive with her knowledge of literature. She kept a diary, and her entries, she planned to have that published later in her life. Her entries were just fabulous, and you get to read them throughout the book. But this I want to read is one of her entries. Mulberry is the name of the plantation. At Mulberry, she lived in claustrophobically close emotional quarters with family and the inhabitants of neighboring plantations. And then it begins a quote from her journal. Peace, comfort, happiness I have found away from home, she wrote. Only your own family, those nearest and dearest, can hurt you. Wrangling, rows, heartburnings, bitterness, envy, hatred, and malice, unbrotherly love, family snarls, neighborhood strife, and ill blood. A lovely brood I have conjured up. But they were all there, and for these many years I have almost forgotten them. I find them always alive and rampant when I go back to semi-village life. For after all, though we live miles apart, everybody flying round on horses or in carriages, it amounts to a village community. Everybody knows exactly where to put the knife. Doesn't that sound lovely? She also, 94, 95, the book, after her death, she never got to publish the book when she was alive, but after her death, there was an initial author, and I don't remember her name, but she published the journals of Mary Chestnut, but she took out all the private stuff. So this reduced this book considerably, but she felt it was inappropriate to publish the private stuff that Mary had written. And it was called something like The Story of the South. If I find it, I'm going to put it up here on the screen for you. But later, someone else, I believe, historian C. Vaughan Woodward, put together all the journals. He included all the information. And he published it in 1993 with Yale University Press. It is 892 pages long. And I was curious. I wanted to see if I could perhaps find this somewhere. And I looked on eBay, and I found an excellent copy for $8.99. Shipping is free. So I'm very curious to read through that journal. That's something I've always loved to read, are people's journal entries. To sort of get inside a person, to see what their perspective in life is on and how they interpret what they're seeing and what they're feeling. I just love to do that. There's another one, Private Thompson at Sumter. This is another journal entry that I just thought, oh, if I could write that well in my own journal. Private Thompson served under Major Robert Anderson, who I'm going to go into last. And this is what he wrote of an encounter. No, this is what Private Thompson wrote after the firing began at Sumter. The thrill that ran through our veins at this time was indescribable. He saw no fear among his fellow soldiers, the author said, and back to the journal, but something like an expression of awe crept over the features of everyone as battery after battery opened fire, and the hissing shot came plowing along, leaving wreck and ruin in their path. That short, passage that he wrote, I think is fabulous because you can see it. I love it when people write so well because I don't. So I had to include that. And lastly, I want to talk about, Major Robert Anderson was the major in charge of Fort Sumter. I was completely impressed with this man. He was a man of deep faith, and he always looked out for the well-being of the men who served underneath him, who served with him. And at one point, he had the families and other workers who were living in this other location before they moved to Fort Sumter. And he had to try to find a way, because things were getting heated, to get himself and his soldiers to Fort Sumter and the women and the children off to another location so they could be safely returned home. So there were 3 boats, and they had to do this in the dark of night. And Sumter sits right at the center. So you have Charleston, and then you have Sumter, and then you have other sort of land, like peninsulas that shoot out on each side. So they couldn't really do this without being seen, possibly. So they had to try to do it, I believe, on a night when there was no moon, so they would have complete darkness. And they had to do this during a window, I believe, a 3-hour window of time, where the boats that were coming from South Carolina to keep an eye on Major Anderson and his troops was not going to pass by to check on them. So they had to do it within that window of time. And the suspense was so great at one point because the people that were rowing the boats, some of the soldiers who said they were good rowers, were not good rowers. So they were struggling to row these boats and to get them moving at the right speed. Oh, the tension was until the very end. And he managed to get everybody safely to their locations. But what he also had to deal with was a lack of communication with Washington. He just couldn't get answers, part of it being that either his messages wouldn't get there, they weren't relayed to the president at the time, there were delays. He was so in the dark about what to do. So he pretty much had to make the majority of these decisions on his own. And with information traveling so slowly, and you couldn't get all of it, what information he was able to get was either a few days old, or it just, what he had to work with was so limited. But I so admire what he was able to pull off to the very end. Just a fabulous person. And the last one I'm going to bring up is William Seward. I believe he was the Secretary of State. And this guy I did not like. I think he was too self-assured. He had his own agenda. You think the Secretary of State is supposed to be working together with the president. William Seward gave the impression to the president that he was working with him. But Seward was also communicating with leaders from the South, and he was giving them a different story. This is the thing, Seward was always convinced that the secession thing was going to blow over. So he wanted to stall those Southern officials who came from South Carolina who wanted to speak with the president. They wanted to meet, but they never were able to because Seward always was stalling them. Seward was telling them, don't worry, we have plans, we're going to evacuate Sumter, which was never true. And Seward had sort of a resentment because he, I believe, had run for the presidency at the same time that Lincoln did, as a Republican, just like Lincoln, but he wasn't nominated. Lincoln was. So I think there was that resentment toward Lincoln, and he just felt he was more qualified than the president. So he did his own things. And I think at the end, there was something that happened, which I'm going to let you read about, that was so pivotal to the final scenario that happened at Sumter that I believe he is responsible for. That if something had happened when it was supposed to happen, maybe they could have avoided the outcome that actually became the outcome. Overall, the story of the Demon of Unrest really does flow beautifully. If you've never been interested in the Civil War, this will get you interested in the Civil War. And another thing, it really does give you a clearer picture of Southern 19th century culture. What that difference was. I think many of us think that it was just those who wanted slavery and those who didn't want slavery. But no, like I mentioned at the beginning, the North was more industrialized. They were more progressive. The South was seemingly stuck in a certain century and never wanted to leave it. So they became, there's a term for it, and I'm not remembering, but when someone becomes outdated, they're no longer useful, if you will, there's a term for that. And this is the scenario that is shown in this book, that this was something that was not to the benefit of the South during this time. They always thought, and I don't know who coined the phrase, but there was someone in this book that you'll learn coined the phrase that cotton is king. They were convinced that because they were the major producers of cotton, not just for the United States, but for Europe, that fate was on their side. People did not want to live without their cotton. Where were they going to get their cotton from to make their clothes and everything else? Therefore, they were justified. And how are they going to continue their business and their economics with cotton production if they didn't have their slaves? Prices would just skyrocket. You know, like I said, same thing, different day when you hear stuff today where businesses will say, well, we can't do that. We can't pay higher wages. It'll, prices will go up. Our business will suffer. When you're stuck in a certain mode and you cannot see left or right, or you don't want to, that sounds like the excuse you would make. And so therefore, I think to myself, the South was probably stuck in that same mentality. And it ended up in the end being their ruin. So this book was wonderful. I can highly recommend it, The Demon of Unrest. I still have to put my little green sticker on there. I'm reading this for my book group, and we'll be meeting next week. We decided to meet not this Thursday, but next Thursday, because it was kind of a thick book and a lot of us needed more time. So that is what I have finished reading. And, I forgot to show you. This is the second book, Mac's book by Adam. This is the one entitled Max in the Land of Lies, World War II. So now I'm reading this. He's in Berlin now, so we're going to find out how Max is going to accomplish it. He has a specific mission. He's got to go to a specific place. He's got to infiltrate, and he's got to relay information back to London about this. So this is going to be interesting. And there's Bergenstein right there. Bergenstein, get it? Bergenstein, I think is just very funny. So this is the book I'm going to be reading, and I'll fill you in on that. And I have not yet started the Book of Marjorie Kemp, and I have not yet started Dante's Divine Comedy, which were the other two that I wanted to read. Now that I've slowed down a little bit, my week has not been so crazy and hectic that I was just tired every day. I think I'll have more time to finish those. Thank you for hanging out with me, people. Don't forget to press that like and subscribe button. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I will see you in just a few days. Bye-bye.